So last week we ended with the Hillel 2 calendar. I thought that I would go ahead and go a little bit deeper into the Hillel 2 calendar this week, but in thinking about that, I think we have a good understanding about how that all came about, right? We were about to go into captivity. Hillel decided that he wanted to make a set calendar that no matter where we were dispersed in the world, that we could all celebrate the feast days on the same day. So we understand the motivation behind the Hillel 2 calendar, but does that make it correct? Because the one thing we've said since we started this calendar study is we as believers do not rely on man's calculations. That's the main point we need to understand. Any calendar that comes to you that is relying on man's calculations, you can almost certainly say that is not from Yahweh. Because Yahweh says that He shares His glory with no man. Right? So when He put the sun, the moon, and the stars in the sky, He said that those are what establishes our days, our years, and our seasons, right? So we're relying on Him for our calendar, not relying on some man's calculations for our calendar. So as we get started today, we're going to talk, first calendar we're going to talk about is the Julian calendar. Then we'll talk about the Gregorian calendar a little bit, but the Julian calendar is basically an adaptation of the Babylonian calendar. We know that the Babylonian calendar is an adaptation of the Sumerian calendar. In week 1, we went over all the monoliths and all that kind of stuff for the origination of calendars and how people would set rocks up to watch the movement of the stars and how that would go. We broke a day down to its very minute second. We broke a month down to the very minute second. We showed that there is no possible way to calculate a solar year because as the earth spins, so does the stars. The stars move as well. So the best thing we have is a good guesstimation. Now I'm not saying that that's not a great guesstimation, but it's a good guesstimation. So we cannot calculate a solar year. If we really want to get technical about it, even on Yahweh's calendar, we cannot calculate a month. Because Shirley might spot the moon 30 minutes before me. When did her month begin?
When she spotted me.
The moment she spotted the moon, right? Her month began at that very moment. I spot it 30 minutes later. Now we're still on the same day, but we didn't start our month at the exact same time, did we? Because we're relying on the Father. We rely on the Father to establish time. The Julian calendar proposed by Julius Caesar in 708 AD, or BC, Ureb Candida, was a reform of the Roman calendar. It took effect 1st of January, 709 AUC or BC, by edict. It was designed with the aid of Greek mathematicians and Greek astronomers such as, I can't say his name, of Alexandria. So originally Rome was going off of a Babylonian type calendar. The calendar had 355 days in it. How many days does our year have in it? 365, right? 365.25 is what the calendar we're on now has in it. But originally the Roman calendar had 355 days in it. But their seasons were sliding, so they made a decree that only Caesar could insert an inserally month, an additional month into the year. So every so often, Caesar would make a decree that an additional month would be added to the year, so it would correct the slide of their calendar. The calendar was a predominant calendar in the Roman world. Most of Europe and in European settlements in the Americas and elsewhere until it was gradually replaced by the Gregorian calendar promulgated in 1582 by Pope Gregory XIII. The Julian calendar is still used in parts of Eastern Orthodox Church and in parts of Oriental Orthodoxy, as well as by the Berbers or the Barbers. So some people are still on the Julian calendar. In fact, we're still on the Julian calendar because the Gregorian calendar is just an adaptation of the Julian calendar. That's what I'm trying to show you with all these calendars that are seeping into the Messianic movement. They are not new calendars. They're old calendars. They're an adaptation. They're trying to take an adaptation of an old calendar and try to make it fit with Yahweh's calendar. So they're trying to make a calculation on what is the right way to celebrate the feast, when's the right times, how do we sight the moon, what stars need to be in place, is there a vernal equinox, do we rely on those things? So they get into all this study of all these ancient calendars, and the next thing you know, they convince themselves that we've been doing it the wrong way. What so easily did hinder you? We've read that in Scripture, right? What so easily did hinder you? When we rely on man's wisdom over Yahweh's instructions, we've got ourselves in a bad place. How many knows that history is written by the victors? History is written by the victors. Those who won the battle. Those who conquered the land. So, let's just go back to recent history, during the Holocaust. If Germany would have won the war, do you think any of us would be thinking about Germany and the negative aspects that we think about it today? 9. No, 9. Because we would all be thinking about it the way they wanted us to think about it. The same way we are conditioned as Americans. I'm a patriotic guy. I served in the military for the majority of my adult life. I love this country. But I am under no delusion that I have been duped on some things concerning my patriotism for this country. Now that's not to say I shouldn't be patriotic still, but there are some negative things in our history as well that we're not really taught in school. We're not taught in history. Unless you really want to go and dig and dig and dig and find those things, you'll never hear about those things. But there's some negative things about our history as a nation. But there's some great things about the history of our nation as well. So when Babylon took us into captivity, we spent, well, some of us spent 2,730 years in that system. Others spent 490 years in that system. So after 490 years, how much of the ancient ways do you think the people that walked out of Babylon were still keeping? Not very many, right? After we came out of Babylon, we began to see that we named our months now. Tammuz, a false god. Yule, a false god. So why did we walk out of Babylon? After walking on the Creator's calendar for centuries, when we walk out of Babylon, now we're calling Yahweh's months by pagan names, when He told us to not even let their names come off our lips.
That's right.
So, history is written by the victors, right? So, in 3 to 4 generations, you can convince a nation of anything. Right now in our nation, we're seeing a transformation take place. How many knows that transformations don't come easy? They always come through trouble and turmoil. This nation, after this is over with, is not going to be the nation that Brother Beaver and Sister Beaver recognized growing up. The nation right now is probably not that nation. But it's going to be so far removed from what we understood. I'm just 48 years old. But it's going to be so far removed from even what I grew up understanding this nation to be, that it will be almost unrecognizable. And by the time my son has children, they'll never even know about the nation I grew up in. About the nation that some others that are older than me grew up in. Because it'll be totally disappeared from our history. It won't be taught. The Julian calendar has two types of a year. A normal year of 365 days and a leap year of 366 days. That sounds pretty familiar, right? That's pretty much what we're on right now. They follow the simple cycle of 3 normal years and 1 leap year, giving an average year that is 365.25 days long. That is more than the actual solar year value, 365.24219 days, which means the Julian calendar gains a day every 128 days. Every 128 years. So even with their best calculation, every 128 years, we still gain a day. Well, since the Julian calendar, 1522 when we went to the Gregorian calendar, so the Julian calendar was 700 BC. So we've gone almost 3,000 years now on losing a day every 128 years. Anybody know why? What does Deca mean? 10. Deca means 10, right? So why is December our 12th month? Anybody know what octa means? 8. Why is October our 10th month? Because our calendar has been sliding. Because they've been basing it off of man's calculations, not off of Yahweh's understanding. For any given event during the years from 1901 to 2099 inclusive, its date according to the Julian calendar is 13 days behind its corresponding Gregorian day. So if you're still on the Julian calendar, you're half a month behind the Gregorian calendar. Because the Gregorian calendar made a couple corrections to the Julian calendar. And the Gregorian calendar is still flawed. The Julian calendar was a revamp of the Babylonian calendar, where the year consisted of 12 months equaling 355 days. An additional month was inserted periodically in an attempt to correct the slide. Julius lengthened the months and inserted an additional day, although the approximation of 365.25 days for the typical year had been known for a long time. Ancient solar calendars had used less precise periods, resulting in a gradual misalignment of the calendar with the seasons. So the calendar didn't actually fit the seasons. Well, when do you plant? What month do you plant your grass?
In the fall or November.
What'd you say, Mark?
November.
November. But what'd you say the first time?
October.
October, November. The reason they calculated a calendar was we've studied this for the last 3 weeks. The reason they originally made a calendar was to keep our agricultural cycle in line, right? So everybody would know exactly when to plant their crops. Exactly what time to get your wheat in the ground, exactly what time to get your corn in the ground, exactly what time to get your fruits growing, fertilizing, and all those types of things. We use a farmer's almanac now. Basically the same thing. But that's why they created a man's calendar, because people weren't relying on Yahweh. So now, we don't know when to plant our grass. It could be October, it could be November. Because the month doesn't tell us anything anymore, does it? It's just us speaking out the name of a false god. It's not set to determine anything anymore. The Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar is the calendar used in most of the world. It's named after Pope Gregory XIII, introduced it in October of 1582. The calendar spaces leap years to make its average year 365.2425 days long, approximating the 365.2422 day typical year that is determined by the Earth's revolution around the sun. The rule for the leap year is every year that is exactly divisible by 4 is a leap year, except for the years that are exactly divisible by 100. Most of us have never encountered that because we're not 100 years old, right? So every year, like the year 2000, how many knows that on a normal leap year calendar, we should have had a leap year that year? But we didn't. Because Pope Gregory said every year that's divisible by 100, we don't have a leap year that year. It's an overcorrection and then a back correction. An overcorrection and then a back correction. Okay. But these central years are leap years if they are exactly divisible by 400. You see that, how that works? Confusing, isn't it? For example, the years 1700, 1800, and 1900 are not leap years, but the years 1600 and 2000 are, sorry, 2000 was a leap year. I don't know why I said that. 1900 was not a leap year, so, because it's not divisible by 4. We can divide 400 years into 2,000 years, right? But we can't divide that in an equal way into 1900, 1800, 1700. We can divide it into 1600. We can divide it into 1200, but we can't divide it into any of the other years. The calendar was a revision of the Julian calendar and had 2 aspects. It shortened the average calendar year by 0.0075 days to stop the drift of the calendar with respect to the equinoxes. So now we see something else peeking its head up. Before it was about the months sliding, about the agricultural things sliding. But now when we get to the Gregorian calendar, we see this word equinox pop up. How many have seen the word equinox pop up in these biblical calendars that have been coming to the Messianic movement lately? How many has ever read about an equinox in the Bible? Should we be going off of equinoxes? It's not in Scripture, is it? To deal with the drift, since the Julian calendar was fixed, the date was advanced 10 days. Thursday, 4 October 1582 was followed by Friday, 15 October 1582. So Pope Gregory XIII made an on-spot correction right there. So you went to bed on the 4th of October and woke up on the 15th of October. Think you were late for work. There was continually in the cycle of weekdays, or there was a continually cycle in the cycle of weekdays, and the Anno Domini calendar era. The reform also altered the lunar cycle used by the church to calculate the date for Easter, Computus, restoring it to the time of the year as originally celebrated by the early church. This calendar era has the alternative secular name, the Common Era. So we say BC and AD. But how many has ever heard BC and CE? So 325 of the Common Era. That's what, if you're reading about Constantine, you're never going to see AD. Everything says 325 CE of the or CE or CA, Common Era. This is a picture, a painting of Pope Gregory XIII. This is the actual declaration that he made, changing the calendar from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. And down here at the bottom, this is a stone relief that some artist made of him with all these wise men sitting around trying to correct the calendar. So that's what happens with all of these calendars. They get 10 or 15 pretty smart guys. Well, what do you think about this? And what do you think about that? And how do we fit this? And how do we fit that? Well, the next thing you know, you got 10 or 15 great minds coming up with this calendar. Do you think one mind can answer that? If one mind can answer that, you're going to have to do a lot of studying to be able to answer to what 15 minds have come up with. Because I promise you, they've twisted those scriptures. How many knows where the word wicked comes from? That candle right there has wicked in it. Because the word comes from the actual twisting of the string, the wicking of the string. And then when you mix it, when you drop that string in wax, it's called the wicking. So what does the Father hate? We're not supposed to mix our crops, are we?
Nope.
We're not supposed to mix our fabrics on our clothes. He hates that mixing. We can't sin and live holy at the same time. We're called to be a holy people, a set apart people. So why are we mixing man's calculations with our observance of what Yahweh told us to do? It doesn't make sense, does it? It's wickedness to do so. The lunar Sabbath calendar. Here's where we're getting into some calendars that have crept their way into the Messianic movement. So the lunar Sabbath calendar consists of 12 lunar cycles or months, each month consisting of 28 to 31 days. There are various revisions of this calendar since its introduction in 2005. The original calendar stated that the weekly Sabbath was regulated by fixed points in a lunar cycle. So let's look at what I've drawn on the board here. So the original lunar Sabbath calendar said that when we saw the first crescent moon, that was day 1, or day 7. How can it be day 1 and day 7 at the same time? Why did we call that a Sabbath if that began our month and you're going off of a lunar Sabbath? Now there was a later revision to that. We'll get into that here in a minute. But the original lunar Sabbath calendar said that when we sighted the first crescent of the new moon, that was the Sabbath. It didn't matter if it was on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. If we sighted it on a Wednesday, then for that lunar cycle, every Wednesday was our Sabbath. Okay? So every 7th day was a Sabbath. And the way that they would try to prove that is you saw the crescent moon, then the quarter moon, you had another Sabbath. The full moon, you had another Sabbath. The last quarter moon, you had another Sabbath. But now you got 10 days before you see the crescent again. So what did they do with the extra 2 or 3 days? They're just non-existent because they called them dark days. Since there was no moon, we didn't count them as days. We waited for the first crescent again. We're going to talk about the Creator's calendar in depth at the end of this. But I assure you, there is no way to divide 7 into 29.5. I know they got this new math called Common Core. I don't even think they could do it in that. You can't divide 7 equally into 29.5. There's just no mathematical way that works. The original stated that the first sighting of the sliver of the new moon was established the Sabbath for that lunar cycle. If the sliver was sighted on whatever we refer to as a Wednesday, then the weekly Sabbath would be on Wednesday for that lunar cycle. With the first Sabbath on the first sliver, the second Sabbath on the first quarter, the third Sabbath on the full moon, and the final Sabbath on the fourth Sabbath on the following waning quarter moon. At which point we were to wait no matter how many days were left in the month for the next sliver. Now we get into the next revision of it. It's called the conjunction, the lunar Sabbath conjunction calendar. Okay? So now there are two versions of this conjunction calendar. One is the lunar Sabbath conjunction calendar. The other one is just the conjunction calendar. The conjunction calendar, they only use that to establish their feast day cycles. They don't use it to establish their weekly Sabbath. They're still going on a Saturday Sabbath, but they may be a day or two off from you at the feast. So you might be celebrating Yom Kippur, and they celebrated it 2 days earlier. Or you might be celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles, and they were already there at the campsite 2 days before you, because they went off the conjunction rather than off the sighting of the first crescent. The first follows the lunar Sabbath in that the Sabbath rotates on the days of the week depending on which day the conjunction occurs. So if the conjunction occurs, I'm going to explain to you what a conjunction is in a minute. But if the conjunction occurred on a Wednesday, if you're on the lunar conjunction Sabbath, then your weekly Sabbath would then be on a Wednesday. Even though nobody ever saw anything, if the conjunction occurred on a Wednesday, then your Sabbath for the rest of that month would be on a Wednesday. And you would be standing in judgment over all of those who sighted the first sliver, and their Sabbath was now on Friday that month. So it's a division. It's just the way the enemy starts bringing in division to his people. The second version only uses the conjunction to establish the feast cycle and what days they will be celebrated on. In astronomy, the new moon is the first lunar phase, when the moon and the sun have some ecliptic longitude. At this phase, the lunar disk is not visible to the unaided eye, except when silhouetted during a solar eclipse. Daylight outshines the earthlight that dimly illuminates the new moon. The actual phase is usually a very thin crescent. Okay, so if you go to the U.S. Observatory and you talk to them about the conjunction, even then, they don't mark the conjunction as when it's completely at the exact same longitudinal direction. As soon as it moves 1 degree off of that exact same longitudinal direction, which in a telescope, you can see that first little thin crescent, they mark that as the conjunction. Now, we won't see that with the naked eye for another day or day and a half. I don't know any astronomers on the hills of Judea that went out with telescopes this big around trying to sight the new moon. As we said before, here is empirical evidence, okay? Now, we can talk about any of these calendars, we can talk about all this kind of stuff, but my faith is in who? Who is your faith in?
Yahweh.
Yahweh and Yeshua, right? That's where our faith resides. So Yeshua was here 2,000 years ago. I can unequivocally prove to you, without question, that during the time Yeshua was here, they were on a Saturday Sabbath. Every 7 days on Saturday Sabbath. I can prove it. No doubts about it. I can also prove that when he was here, they set new moon spotters out on the hills of Judea to sight the new moon. And it took at least 2 of those spotters returning to the Sanhedrin to declare that they had saw the moon, and then the Sanhedrin would send shofars out, and they would blow shofars over the hills of Judea, letting everybody know that the new moon had been sighted and that we should begin a new month. But what I cannot show you is Yeshua rebuking anybody in the whole of the New Testament for doing it wrong. As important as his calendar is, if they were doing that wrong, do you not think he would have made mention of it? Don't you think there would be some historical evidence of him standing against them for doing something wrong, especially so significant as our calendar? How many's read about Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur says that if we get that day wrong, he'll cut us off from our people, but not only that, he'll cut us off from himself. That's a pretty weighty judgment, isn't it? His feasts are so important that the spring feast, Passover, if we missed it, if for some reason we missed the spring feast, we still had the... Now that's not saying you could redo the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because, oh, you missed the Passover, but now everybody else is doing Passover, and you were unclean, so you can't partake of that, but you can go ahead and partake of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But 30 days later, you had a second opportunity to partake of the Passover, to correct your calendar, because that's how important the calendar is. The Father gave you the ability to correct it, even a month into it. We have to be focused on what the Father said and not on man's calculations. Conjunctions are determined by the calculated point in time, normally by the U.S. Observatory, and is not visible or able to be determined by any other means. Daniel 7:25. And he shall speak great words against the Most High. Who's he talking about here? Talking about the Anamessiah, right? In Daniel 7. He's talking about this figure that rises up, takes control basically of the world. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. Whose laws? Yahweh's laws, right? If he changes times, can we keep Yahweh's laws?
Not properly.
We'll be off on the feast days if we changes the times, right? We see that that's what happened, and the reason Israel went into captivity for 2,730 years. 1 Kings 12:32-33. And Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah.